I'm Tessa. It's nice to see you all, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today. I am a PhD student in the Kids' Lab at the University of Pittsburgh. Basically, what that means is I've gotten the incredible privilege over the past few years of just being able to work on new methods to survey birds, which are, of course, my favorite animals, as I'm sure many of you in this room feel the same way. My research is focused on how to use autonomous sensors like autonomous acoustic recorders to unlock new ways of observing birds and understanding their interactions with environments in ways that we can't just as human observers. So in particular, today I'll talk about 3 of these autonomous sensing methods that I've worked on: eavesdropping on birds with autonomous acoustic recorders, using acoustic localization to pinpoint birds' positions, their movements and behaviors, and using moth photo booths to understand prey availability for birds. So we'll start by talking about these autonomous acoustic surveys, but first I want to talk about the surveys and why we care. Starting with the big picture, over the history of the Earth, we estimate that life has gone through about 5 mass extinctions in which over 60% of the species on the planet went extinct. These were thought to have been caused by meteors or geologic events. Now, evidence points to the Earth just starting to enter a 6th mass extinction in which species are going extinct 1,000 times faster than they were before humans came around. And it's not just extinctions that are happening too, it's also just a general loss of the amount of wildlife. So for birds in particular, over the past 50 years, the bird population in North America is estimated to have declined by over 25%. That's a loss of almost 3 billion birds. And as birders, you have a front row seat to this. In some of your lifetimes, you have probably noticed a decline in some species populations. You've probably noticed migration isn't quite the same as it used to be. So we care about these losses in birds in particular, but birds are also a canary in the coal mine. They are important indicators of habitat change and ecosystem health because they are globally distributed like nothing else, and they are intricately connected to their environment. So, for example, grasshopper sparrows are sensitive to pollution from overuse of pesticides, and wood thrush rely on native plants in the understory, so they can be indicators of understory health. And not only do birds rely on particular environments, but we also need birds too. Birds, like hummingbirds, are pollinators of fruits and flowers. Birds are seed dispersers for many plants. So if you like black cherry trees, thank a bird, because black cherry seeds are actually better at germinating after they've passed through a bird's gut. Birds provide pest control. They eat a lot of bugs. So if you net crops off from birds, insects can infest those plants, and studies show that they have significantly more leaf damage and produce fewer fruits when you don't let birds eat the bugs on them. And lastly, as birders, of course, we feel a connection to birds. So even without the services that they provide us for our ecosystems, I think we can all agree they are very worth protecting. So how do we protect birds on large scales? We need to understand what causes bird population decline and then take action against those factors to prevent and reverse population loss through actions like restoring native plants, regulating the application of pesticides, and so on. So this cycle of understanding and action requires us to be able to survey bird populations on large scales and connects birds' presence and absence with the disturbances or the restoration techniques that we're trying to measure to see if they're effective. Bird population surveys can be observational without a specific experiment, like the North American Breeding Bird Survey. These are usually conducted over large scales. Or instead of being observational, they can also be experimental, like fencing off a field from deer and noticing which species do better or worse inside versus outside the deer fence. Several years ago, almost all of these bird population surveys were by direct observation, where a person would go out to each site and write down what species they encountered. But these days, more and more ecologists are using autonomous recorders, where you can bring it to a site, set it down, connect it to a tree, and walk away from that recorder for weeks or months to record and capture the distinctive sounds of particular species that are present at a site. And the reasons that we do this, first, recorders are fantastically suited to survey birds. Over 95% of bird species are surveyable by sound. They allow us to gather a lot more data than human surveyors because they can record for weeks, although you only have to visit the site once to drop them off and then pick them up. This allows us to survey species in places or times when they would otherwise be very hard to survey, like at the tops of mountains in Hawaii. Acoustic recording is very commonly used, or for studying nocturnal species like whippoorwills. Third, to gather all of that data, imagine a person tromping around in the woods. This can change animals' behavior. So if you're specifically interested in bird behavior, you want an autonomous method to study them potentially. The list is so long. One advantage of all that extra survey effort is they can wait around for rare events like rare species, ones that are hard to detect. And finally, once you've done all these surveys, you have a permanent record of the environment at that place and time. So we might be collecting these data for one particular purpose, but many years in the future, someone can take these data, reanalyze them with different methods or ask different questions. So it gives us a museum specimen of the acoustic environment. The acoustic recorder we use is the audio moth. I have this one today that I'll pass around. It's just a circuit board connected to 3 AA batteries, essentially. So it's extremely small and lightweight, and it's very inexpensive compared to traditional acoustic recorders 10 years ago would have been hundreds or even $1,000. And you can buy one of those recorders for less than $100 now. So that has enabled us to actually scale up to large-scale autonomous acoustic surveys. The process that we do that by is first, you can see how many recorders we end up using. We prep them and we schedule them to record at a particular time of day, often the dawn forest to capture when birds are very acoustically active, but also at night. Some years will place 1,000 recorders in the field for just 1 year's worth of surveys. We place them at our study sites, which might be the instant, like a forest restoration experiment, where we're comparing the impacts of 2 types of forest restoration. And this picture shows one of those audio moths deployed in our very high-tech Ziploc baggie. So then we leave them in the woods to listen. They record essentially everything that you would hear if you were standing at that point. And they can record about 150 hours of audio. After about a couple months of recording 2 hours per day, we go back and we retrieve the recorders, we download the data off of them, and then we finally need to analyze the data to identify which species are present. But if you actually sat down and listened to those data by ear, let's do the calculations here. If we have 1,000 recorders, they each recorded 3 hours a day for 50 days. That's 17 continuous years of audio. And I love listening to bird sounds, but I don't have 17 years. So to account for that, to deal with that massive amount of data, we use sound ID algorithms, which can predict, not tell us for sure, which species are in our recordings and help us sift through these data. These algorithms are pretty similar to Merlin. Raise your hand if you've heard of Merlin sound ID. That's awesome. I am so glad to see that. So it's a cell phone app. Our algorithms are a bit different because instead of being made for your cell phone, they are designed to run on a really powerful computer and run through hundreds of hours of audio at a time. But both Merlin and our algorithms use the same trick to be able to identify birds. They're not actually listening to the audio. Instead, the audio is translated into spectrograms, that picture that shows up when you're using the Merlin Sound ID feature. And that can be read a lot like music, with time on the horizontal axis, frequency on the vertical axis, and the darkness at any point is essentially the loudness of the sound. So I chose this picture because I think it's great when you actually listen to the sound, you can sort of see how the sound translates into the spectrogram. Here's what that sounds like. You can sort of see how the picture is a good representation of what a winter wren sounds like. And every species sound, if it's distinctive when we hear it, is also very likely to be distinctive on the spectrogram. The algorithms that we use to analyze these spectrograms are called convolutional neural networks. They're made for image analysis, so it makes sense that we're using them on spectrograms. They work by learning to see these really basic patterns like lines, edges, and dots, and then combining them to form increasingly complex features so that they can represent detailed images. A great thing about convolutional neural networks, and one reason they work really well, is that we don't have to teach them what each individual bird sounds like. They independently learn how to represent and quote unquote understand or identify bird sounds just by using a set of training data that we ourselves have annotated. So we essentially provide a field guide to our algorithm and it learns from what we know. Because so many people are using Merlin, I just want to talk about also how well do these algorithms even work. And an easy way to think of this is in two measurements. The first one is precision. That's essentially if an algorithm says there's a yellow warbler in a recording, how often is it correct? And that might be about 95% for a pretty good algorithm. So that's 1 out of every 20 recordings is a false positive. When you think of it that way, it's actually a pretty high rate of misidentification, considering it's just a 3-second clip that this algorithm is trying to identify the bird in. The second form of precision metric is recall, which is essentially what percentage of the yellow warbler songs that existed in the recording does the algorithm find. And that might be about 50%, which now might sound low, but when you consider we have 17 years of recordings, that's still a ton of data on yellow warblers that we'll end up finding. And these two things are trade-offs. So the more precise a model is, the more sounds it will miss. Keep in mind, those are pretty rough factors. So performance varies based on things like confusion species. These algorithms will misidentify a hermit thrush for a wood thrush. It varies by environment. It's much harder to identify birds when there's ambient noise. And we actually had a train confused as a northern saw-whet owl once. So it's very surprising stuff you turn up in this audio sometimes. A rarity actually impacts the performance a lot. So if a species is rare, the model is likely to both over-report it when it's not there and miss it when it is there. So a classic example of this is Philadelphia vireo. When the Merlin algorithm first came out, gosh, so many people were reporting Philadelphia vireos. And the Merlin team actually had to remove Philadelphia vireo from the output list because so many red-eyed vireos were confused with it. Lastly, regional dialects can have a pretty big impact on the performance as well. You can imagine many other things that would impact the way these algorithms work, but this is just to say that they are really, they're imperfect and they still require us to use our judgment to assess how they're doing. The way they do it in particular, or the way we do it, is we pay special attention to removing all of the false positives. We don't want our models to say that there are Philadelphia Vireos suddenly breeding in Pennsylvania. We know that's pretty much impossible. So the predictions of this model might look like this, where it's scoring these 3-second clips, these three-second clips, with a score that represents how likely it is for these species to be in the recording. In this case, we're looking for a black-billed cuckoo, which is this middle recording. What we do is we sort the clips for each site by the score. So we rank clips more highly if the classifier thinks that there's a black-billed cuckoo in them. And then we will listen from the top scoring clips down. And as soon as we hear, yes, there's a black-billed cuckoo at this site, we no longer have to listen to the other hundreds of hours of recording made at that site. So really what these classifiers end up doing is saving us time so that we can then be certain, hey, there's this species of conservation concern. It's definitely at our site. So that is about all I wanted to say about our general autonomous acoustic surveys. Now I want to talk about something that we do that goes beyond just saying whether a species is present or absent at a site. A big limitation to that first method is that we don't have any information about where the bird is relative to the recorder, how many birds there are in the environment. And if we're tracking populations, we really need to know how many individuals there are over time. So acoustic localization lets us do this. It's essentially triangulating the position of a bird's sound using an array of microphones that are synchronized with each other to the millisecond level. We place the microphones close enough to each other so that multiple mics can hear the same bird. So when the bird produces a sound, as it travels out, it's recorded first by the microphone that the sound is closest to. In this example, it's that mic in the top right corner. Then the sound continues to travel out, and it arrives at each other recorder with some delay that's shown in red. That's the time delay of arrival. And we can use the time delay of arrival to build up a curve in space along which this bird may possibly have been. So that's the curve that's formed by the time delay between those two recorders. And when we do that for all of the pairs, roughly the place that those curves intersect is where we estimate the sound arrived from. Knowing the position of birds can tell us a lot about their lives in more detail. It expands the types of scientific questions we can ask about them by letting us do things like mapping territories of individual animals, which can tell us if the animals preferentially use or avoid certain features in the habitat. We can study animals' individual behaviors, such as their singing rates or movement, and these are really important for ground truthing statistical methods for scaling up the methods that I talked about in the first part of the talk, like how many calls corresponds to what number of individual birds. We can also study the behavior of multiple individuals at a time, which is very challenging to do in person, especially if you have something like 20 yellow warblers in a 250 meter by 250 meter plot. It's just hopeless to keep track of their social lives. Lastly, we can also measure the properties of sounds, including their amplitude or directionality, but I think a really cool application of this is we can actually associate sounds with individual birds based on their territories. So we can start to learn the individual properties of birds' voices. It turns out that, like people, most bird species have individual voices. So basically, I love acoustic localization. It's amazing. And I want to tell you a little bit about some experiments I did for specifically the behavioral monitoring part of it to demonstrate how well it works. A big challenge of acoustic localization used to be that It's very time consuming to do. And our lab recently developed this pipeline to automate the whole process of detecting bird sounds, figuring out which recorder heard each individual bird, even the birds that are vocalizing at the same time as each other, finding those time delays of arrival, and then estimating the position of the bird. So to put this to the test, I set up an array. I got to go to Edmonton, Alberta, and set up an array at the Ministic Wild area. It was 49 recorders that were about 40 meters apart from each other each. And I had these recorders recording for a month and applied the localization algorithms to those data. But I also wanted to test whether this algorithm was reliable at gathering behavioral data. And because I'm a birder, I really wanted to go observe some bird behaviors too. So I needed to get some verifiable data on what I wanted to measure. And to get this, I did in-person observations of these 4 example species. First, we did what's called a focal follow, which is I would find an individual bird singing and I would follow it around. I had a clicker, 2 clickers on my phone, one in which I recorded the time each bird sang, every time it sang, and one in which I recorded every time it moved. And then when the bird moved far enough away, I would quickly gather a GPS point to record every perch that it went to. So essentially, I was stalking these 4 birds. But I ended up getting some really cool data from this. I even watched one least flycatcher sing 1,000 times in the course of 30 minutes. He was very macho. Second, we also did spot mapping, which is where we walked systematically through the array and we recorded the position of each individual bird to give us information about the position of individual territories and the number of birds that were using this little plot. So just to get a feel for the kind of data I got from the automated acoustic localization part, here are the results for the whole season. The black dots are the active microphones. The colorful dots are the localized songs of each of the species. So these figures represent dozens of birds going about their days every day, singing to defend their territories and attract mates. Because a lot of my goals in this project required distinguishing individual birds, we needed a way to take these raw results and figure out which songs belong to individual birds. So I did that by building up tracks of movements of the birds. You can see these birds moving throughout their territories over time. And now that I have the individual identities of birds from the tracks, I wanted to say, okay, how good is this localization method at recapitulating the places that an individual bird moves to? So I did find the localization array was great at this. Obviously, that's why I put it in my talk. So for example, here's an animation from a zoomed in subset of the array of a localized bird moving on the left and me following it around on the right. This is sped up maybe 20 times from actual speed, but you can see this does a really amazing job and is probably in some cases more precise than a person because I only recorded a bird as moving if it moved more than 5 meters. Next up, trying to map territories. These are the focal follows of the 2 species that I followed the most. And each cluster of red X's represents all the song locations of one individual. So you can see there are about 5 or 6 different yellow warblers and a bunch of different least flycatchers that I followed. When I plot the density of vocalizations underneath those, you start to see these really nice territory boundaries. I didn't follow every species on the array, and the ones that don't have red X's associated with them were in fact real birds that we verified using spot mapping. So it just showed that this method is also pretty fantastic at creating clusters of territories. Now those last graphs were just localization from the 4 days that I was following those 2 species. But if we look at the whole season, you can just start to see these beautifully defined singing territories of these birds that are made of tens of thousands of localized songs. And I would argue this is data that it's literally impossible to get in any other way besides automated acoustic localization. Lastly, I wanted to see whether localization could estimate abundance. So as my in-person abundance estimate, remember I was using those number of unique individuals observed during spot mapping, and my localization abundance estimate was the maximum number of individuals that were tracked during any time period. And I found that these estimates matched incredibly well, which suggests that acoustic localization could be an excellent source of ground truth data for abundance too. So this is a slide that I show when I give this talk both to bird club audiences, but also to scientific audiences as well, because this really opens up a ton of questions for ornithologists and ecologists, many of them which they require so much data over time, you probably couldn't do them without automated localization. Finally, I just wanted to give a short introduction to the 3rd chapter of my dissertation, which I gathered data for last summer, that I'm hoping to demonstrate a new way that we can measure bird population decline by understanding what's going on with birds' food sources. Caterpillars are nature's sausages. They are soft, thinly wrapped tubes of protein, and they are perfect for feeding hungry and quickly growing young birds. So caterpillars are such an important food source for birds that 96% of terrestrial birds in North America raise their young in part or solely on insects. And of those diets, they are dominated by caterpillars or moths. So you might expect when there are fewer caterpillars, studies show that nestlings are more likely to die or have worse body condition. So threats to insects are likely to be threats to birds as well. There's been a lot of debate about whether insects are declining the same way that birds are. We can name a bunch of possible causes like pesticides, intensive agriculture, deforestation, and invasive plants, which outcompete insect-required host plants. But the reason we can't really say for sure how insect populations are doing is because there's so little comprehensive long-term monitoring for insects. It's very hard to survey them. So we still haven't established the extent to which threats to insects, such as pesticide applications, truly are affecting bird populations, and whether that can explain the declines that we're seeing in bird species. Part of the reason it's so hard to study caterpillars and other insects is surveys for them take so long to get so little data. You see, if you watch this entire video, this person finds like 1 caterpillar. So it's barely enough to say whether there's any caterpillars at this site, much less tracking different species of caterpillars that emerge at different times or that are used by different bird species. Essentially, we're just flailing in the dark with this kind of method. So try to replicate that at dozens of sites multiple times per year and get support to do it year after year. And it's just, unfortunately, it's not feasible and it hasn't been done. So the result is that we're left with a lot of gaps in our understanding about these really important parts of our ecosystem. My approach to get around this challenge is to develop the use of an automated moth monitoring system. The prototype I used, which I did not build because I wouldn't have built something like this, It's a 20-pound metal box that's connected to 50 pounds of 12-volt batteries. Luckily, the current prototypes are only maybe 10 pounds, so this was really an early experiment. But this powers a UV light and a Raspberry Pi mini computer that has control of a webcam. And this essentially attracts moths and then takes pictures of them when they come to land on this white backboard. So here's a video of this in action. This is actually a pretty slow night, or maybe it's early in the night, because you can see usually these boards are just covered with moths during a really nice warm night. This is a real picture from one of my camera traps, and the colorful boxes on the picture are the result of running moth identification algorithms on these data. These can detect the moths and also predict what species they are. They use really similar algorithms to the bird identification ones, the convolutional neural networks. If you've ever used iNaturalist, anyone? It's a very similar algorithm to the iNat algorithm. The particular study I was doing with these boxes was to understand the impacts of tebuthenazide, which is also called mimic. It's a pesticide which is intended to kill caterpillars of the spongy moth, which is an invasive species. It used to be called gypsy moth. But this pesticide can kill any species of caterpillar that's ingested enough of it. Now, it's being sprayed all across Pennsylvania in some of the most densely forested regions, but I want to emphasize that we do need to use this pesticide because without it, hundreds of giant oak trees that are also the main hosts for a bunch of other caterpillar species would die from being overexploited by this invasive spongy moth. But the question is, because we're scientists, we should ask, well, how does this affect other species of moths? How does it affect birds? Should we modify the schedule of spraying to give birds and moths more time to recover between sprays? To study this, I dragged those two gigantic metal boxes around central Pennsylvania to 60 sites, stratified by the number of years since treatment with pesticide, because my goal is to understand how long should we wait between sprays for the moth community to recover. We also put up audio recorders at each site to monitor the birds in the breeding season. I haven't fully finished analyzing these data, but this is just a preliminary peek at the number of individual birds that are detected on average per picture. I'm finding some expected relationships in here. The abundance of moths per capture does depend on the year of the since spraying. So in 2024, we tend to see fewer moths. But this relationship also depends on things like the composition of the host plants at a given site. So even a site that's sprayed in 2024 that has a ton of oaks will probably have more moths in it than a site that's just a big open field without any of these nice big trees. So because of that, in order to understand the true impact of pesticides on moths and birds, I still need to account for these different variables, but it's a work in progress. The next steps for this project will be looking at the birds themselves as well. So analyzing the presence of bird species in my audio data using our typical bird song classifiers, but also building an audio classifier to detect begging calls of fledglings. This is what a kestrel begging call looks like on a spectrogram. I'm sure Tom is very familiar with the screech of them. So the goal is to relate moth abundance to the survival of nestlings up to the fledging stage, which is when they start to produce much louder and more detectable sounds. So that is most of what I have to talk about, and I'm excited to take some questions. But first, I just want to say I'm really lucky to have a lot of people to put on my thank you slide, and I wanted especially to thank the surprise guests in the audience, Tom and Patty. Can you just say hi? You probably all know Tom and Patty. They are, without them, I wouldn't be standing here. They initially got me into birds through their math banding station, and I absolutely owe my path to starting banding with them. So thank you guys. We love you. Thank you. Tom?
I got a question. Is there any thought in the future of putting those big boxes up in the trees to see what's different?
People do that. People do climb trees and put up the smaller boxes, smaller version of the boxes, as well as audio recorders to listen for little grasshoppers or cicadas. But yeah, it's just an area that not enough people have the skill to climb trees to do that.
How did you end up in Alberta? Why was that spending?
It's because I have a collaborator there who had done a bunch of this localization before, and I also really wanted to visit boreal forests, so I applied to work with her.
You were using the little audio devices that you passed around. Are they being used by Atlas groups? You know, I participated in the breeding bird surveys in Pennsylvania and Maryland. To what extent can they be used?
Can you repeat the questions?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so the current question is about whether the audio recorders are being used by Atlas groups. And to my knowledge, they're not being used systematically by Atlas groups. Although I do know of individual people who are verifying presence of state endangered species using audio recorders, for instance.
So your small audio recorders, when you had the slides up, one of the slides looked as though it had a little SD card. Is that how it's recorded on an SD card?
Yes, it's all saved onto that little chip.
So say if someone like any of us purchase one just for fun on their own properties, how do you just put it into your computer and play it?
Yeah.
So you could listen to it.
Yes, absolutely. And if you wanted a recommendation for a more user-friendly recorder, there's one that's runs about $150, but you can set it with your cell phone and more easily set it up the way you want it to. So if you would like to get into something like this, I'd be happy to share some information about it. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question, did I? The question was, how is the audio saved onto these recorders? And if you wanted to get into this, how would you listen to the audio?
If there were high winds or weather affecting, are they secured? Very secure, you know, just the weather and wind and affecting.
The question is if the weather and wind affects the recorders and how secure are they? They are pretty secure. I have a fantastic recording of a moose walking up to one of my recorders in Alberta and crunching on the microphone. This moose came by and crunched on a bunch of my microphones. But it lived. The big thing that things like rain impact are audio quality. There's a lot of wind. It's almost impossible to hear, which is a big problem in grasslands. And then we often have chipmunks or spiders like making little holes in our Ziploc bags. So if rain gets into those, it can short circuit the recorder.
I'm perceiving that you were working with these to research the usefulness, the accuracy, the extent that you can use them for other ways. So is it still just experimental, or is this technique being used?
Is it still experimental or is the technique being used? This technique is now probably collecting more data about birds than people are. Of course, it's collecting them at a single site for 150 hours during the breeding season, so it doesn't have nearly the spatial extent of all these tons of citizen science projects, banding projects, breeding bird surveys. But I will say this is no longer theoretical. It's actually quite useful, especially for remote areas or really large scale projects.
I was just thinking it would be something that we could use for the marsh bird monitoring, that would save you a lot of paddling through the weeds. Wouldn't we get more?
We were doing some studies. We had recorders out in the field. But those cost a lot of money, somebody has to go out and set them up. It was still just easier to go out there.
Yeah, so the comment was that these would be really useful potentially for marsh bird surveys. But that they're pretty expensive, they still require maintenance, and it's the scale of.
Okay, so here's one difference. One thing that we were trying to do on that study was, I think this is like 4, 5, 6 years ago. So some of the network detection of the marsh bird calls, I know that this didn't seem to be picking up things as well as. Yeah.
The calls don't carry as far, so you would need more recorders.
Yeah,
So
we have like one recorder, 1 point, as opposed to a whole network. So if the bird's 100 meters away, then.
So it just wasn't done right.
What?
It just wasn't done right back then.
You can have trees of time to business problem. In the market, there's no trees at time.
Yeah, that's all for that. Well, we had poles, we had them on poles.
Yeah, but the poles are getting blown around, the trees are a little more steady.
I don't want to be replaced just yet.
You know, I do want to make a point about, you say, I don't want to be replaced, and
Supplement.
I think that's really important to mention because people care about the things that they interact with. So I care about birds because I interact with them when I went out banding with Tom. I don't think it's wise to replace all human surveys. That's why in a lot of my research, it involves going out there pretty frequently, observing the birds themselves. And truly, it just leads to better quality science when you are also out there understanding the birds' lives and forming these hypotheses, asking these questions. So as much as I use these methods to help me get a ton of data about birds, all of this is driven by me just enjoying going out and seeing them too and wanting them to stick around for a long, long time.
I have a question. When you do population estimates, and when you do you just count the ones that sing, or is there some sort of an assumption behind, if the bird is singing, it probably has a mate, it probably has a family?
The question is, do we do population estimates, and is that estimated just for singing birds, or do we assume the birds have a family? It's currently so hard to estimate abundance from these recordings that we don't do numerical population estimates, but we do maps of where the birds are and aren't present. When people do population estimates using point count data, most of those detections are auditory detections of mostly male birds singing. So the assumption in all these population estimates is that every male bird represents maybe 1 and 1.8 birds or something like that. Don't quote me on that. I'm not the person actually doing that. But yeah, they do make an assumption that the presence of a male represents a pair potentially, which is a big challenge to doing large scale data collection is you're not actually getting demographic data of birds over time.
Can your research be applied to bats?
Can the research be applied to bats? Yes, I think that bats were actually one of the original groups that were surveyed with these because surveying bats in person is extremely difficult. You can't hear them or identify them by their sounds most of the time. And if you want to catch them, you have to get a rabies shot first. Both bats and underwater mammals were sort of the main initial targets of acoustic recordings like this.
I have a suggestion for using this technology out at Erie Bluffs. I don't know if there's anybody in here from the park. But I could envision an array of recorders out there over a season or several seasons. Because what I see happening out there is the bicycles are disturbing the breeding population of the birds. As they keep making more trails, they're dividing the territory up. And I'm wondering, I would like to see a study done of how many breeding birds are being lost out there to the bicycles.
So the comment was that at Erie Bluffs, the bicycle paths and continually dividing the habitat may impact birds' territories and their populations at the Erie Bluffs, right?
Right.
And
Bluffs being fun.
there are some good studies on how even something as small as a power line cut can spatially impact how many territories the birds can put into a forest, for instance. So it is an interesting question. And there's also a bunch of research during COVID about when people stopped using certain areas, how much that changed the behavior of the wildlife that lived there.
There are some questions and comments in the chat. So would you like to read them or would you like me to read them?
I can read them.
Okay.
Let's see.
Bob Mulvihill left you 3 very glowing recommendation comments.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I see Bob is watching and Jack is watching. Thank you guys both
We
for
have
coming.
local people, we have people from Southwest PA, we have people from Florida watching today.
Oh my gosh. And
So it's
that's
yeah.
awesome. Allie, thank you for coming. That means a lot to me. Okay, so I'll read some of these questions.
Go ahead.
The question is, what do you hope will happen with the findings in your dissertation? I'm working on publishing these findings, and because they're mostly focused on methods, what I do is I meet up with a lot of people using these technologies, and I learn how they're using them, and I share what I know, so that they might better use them to do their own science. Charles says, so you're doing 2D triangulation, assuming the birds are close to the ground or within a small window vertically. This is opposed to the work of Yake and Mennel, who are doing 3D triangulation, looking for migrating birds. I never expected someone to bring up Mennel in this conversation, but he's a researcher who's pioneered a lot of acoustic localization, and yes, he's done 3D triangulation. It's very hard to triangulate birds in 3 dimensions because you have to have the recorders above and below the birds if you use that hyperbolic method that I described. So some people use something called a direction of arrival localization, where instead of let's just simplify that. Instead of using a big array of recorders, they're using maybe microphones that are just centimeters apart from each other. And the tiny changes in when a waveform arrives at each of those microphones gives you a direction that the sound came in from. You combine a bunch of microphones that all point in a direction for a given sound, you can sort of estimate where that sound was produced. What those types of recorders are, they're hard to find made commercially. So that's part of why I use the methods that I do. Question, how well does the software recognize bird mimics, birds with similar vocalizations or call notes? Mimics are a huge problem for this software. If you've ever heard a mockingbird making a Phoebe sound, you know, it's very, very convincing. Our lab doesn't work with a ton of mimics, but we do have study species that are confusing to the algorithm, like a scarlet tanager, a rose-breasted grosbeak, and a robin. When they're far enough away from the recorder, they sound pretty similar. So we handle that by making sure we include all of those species in our classifier and providing lots of examples of clips where each of those species are present. Jack says, is the funding of your lab likely to be adversely affected by recent political actions? I will say, honestly, I know people whose funding has been affected. Because our lab does work with AI, we might be more shielded by this, but I don't feel that AI research is more deserving of funding than other forms of research. So I will be disappointed to see if other people have to leave our field because they can't get the money to stay. Those are the questions. One more question.
How about your own career? What kind of aspirations do you have?
The question was, what are my aspirations for my own career? And I'm still figuring that out. There's nothing set in stone anymore, but I would really love to become a professor. And if not, I'd really like to work for a conservation organization like Audubon or American Bird Conservancy, because they do a lot of on the ground conservation work for birds, and they're starting to use methods like this.